Hello everyone. Tonight we're going to start with something really odd, lyrical, and painful: the Aztec Empire's legal system. In addition to their pyramids, accurate calendars, and yes, blood-soaked ceremonies, the Aztecs were a culture that practiced more than just religious sacrifice. Additionally, they developed a legal system with a variety of frightening and inventive penalties. Imagine putting chili powder into your wounds while stealing food and being hauled through the city nude, or being made to breathe in smoke until you fainted because you chopped down the wrong tree. This was Aztec law, and punishment was both a performance and a policy in their society. Therefore, these weren't the deeds of a lunatic. So how did the Aztecs maintain order in some of the most bizarre, cruel, and even comical ways? Let's get started. The Aztec Empire is frequently associated with blood-soaked pyramids, priests wielding obsidian blades, and heart sacrifices, not precisely a society renowned for its benevolent treatment of human capital. The Aztecs, however, did not just lash out with knives at anyone who irritated them. They possessed a surprisingly well-organized legal system, even sophisticated. Cruel? Of course, not a mess, though. Your HOA would be envious of the rules, codes, and organizational structure of Aztec justice. The Huehuetlactolli, a collection of sage advice and guidelines that addressed everything from marriage and business dealings to how to avoid a terrible death in public, contained laws. Although there were no leather-bound law books, there were judges, real, specialized authorities who took their duties very seriously, and these laws were passed down through the generations. Just stern looks and a great memory for punishment options, no powdered wigs. Indeed, they had courts of appeal. If the community already perceived you as the person who stole the corn twice, you had little chance of winning your case before higher courts. Priests and elder nobility, who were regarded as knowledgeable, seasoned, and well-versed in legal customs, were frequently judges. They were not beyond accepting bribes, of course, but you could be put to death if you were found bribing them. Therefore, everyone actually played the game with caution. Aztec justice was genuinely unique because it combined pomp and morality. Not only was justice done, it was done. In order to impart lessons, punishments were intended to be used loudly, in public, and frequently with props, not discreetly behind closed doors. You were dragged, painted, shaved, or metaphorically changed into a warning poster with legs in addition to simply paying a fine for a crime. The most Aztec portion comes next. The severity of some penalties varied according on social class. Nobles faced heavier penalties and were held to higher standards. A noble who did the same could lose his head, his land, or his titles. A commoner could be fined or flogged. Aztec justice was therefore not arbitrary. It was shrewd, fashionable, theatrical, and public. Additionally, the empire ensured that you and your neighbors would never forget breaking the law. You violated an Aztec law then. Perhaps you stole a basket of maize, consumed pulque when underage, or, let's hope not, fell a sacred tree. The Aztec judicial system is about to confront you, regardless of the nature of your offense. There isn't a lawyer, so don't waste your time calling one. The Aztec courts were extremely organized, but they weren't particularly comfortable. Instead of a comfortable courtroom play, picture a stone platform with stern men wearing feathered cloaks surrounding it. Except for the section where someone would be shaved, painted, or lashed in front of a crowd, the trial would be held in public, frequently in a plaza or temple court, and it wasn't intended for showmanship. Usually, judges known as Tlaxcitlan, wise elders or noblemen educated in the rules and traditions of the empire, heard cases. They were not allocated at random. Instead, they had to spend years studying, commit lengthy passages of the law code to memory, and develop the ability to recognize dishonesty at a distance. If you didn't enjoy the sound of public flogging, you didn't debate with them. In addition to defending oneself, the accused may occasionally have an elder or family member speak for them. Let's face it though, unless you were extremely lucky or convincing, the odds were probably not in your favor. Witnesses, evidence, and even many courts, including a high court and an appeal at the emperor level, were all present. Yes, you could push your case all the way to the top, but it was a difficult voyage, and let's just say that there wouldn't be much paperwork left over if the emperor found you guilty. You'll note right away that the Aztecs didn't think things should be prolonged. No years of debate, no protracted trials. Punishment frequently occurred on the same day as judgment, which was swift. That's efficiency. Skin-peeling efficiency that is terrifying. No jails, too. Criminals were not kept in storage by Aztec civilization. You were either executed, enslaved, fined, or humiliated. And occasionally all four. However, you were never overlooked. Legal rights and technicalities were not important to Aztec courts. They were about public spectacle, social order, and moral clarity. Therefore, if you're in front of an Aztec judge, stand up straight, speak slowly, and try not to perspire too much. That's the kind of thing they notice. Children who misbehave typically receive a timeout or sometimes a harsh scolding. They received something a bit more powerful in the Aztec kingdom, introducing the cool smoke chamber. Perhaps the most theatrical way to say, "Listen to your mother," in history. Obedience was mandatory in Aztec homes. Children were supposed to help out around the house, work, listen, and show respect for their elders. The concept was straightforward. Teach children to be hard workers, decent citizens, and potential soldiers or weavers at a young age. And little Cuauhtemoc got cold if he dared not speak up or wanted to sweep the floor. Tlessilcheli was the name of the punishment, which entailed putting the misbehaving youngster in a tiny confined area, such a storage room or hut, where chilies had been thrown onto a fire. The smoke that filled the room as they burnt was so strong that it caused your sinuses to scream, your throat to constrict, and your eyes to burn. Imagine pepper spray with a spiritual twist. The encounter was unforgettable, even though the child didn't suffer any bodily harm, at least not permanently. They had not been bloodied, bruised, or battered. Rather, they were overpowered. In just a few minutes, the sensory overload of cold vapor replaced hours of parental scolding, and the purpose was shame-based conditioning rather than cruelty. You won't likely sass your parents again once you've given up your desire to misbehave, at least not until your voice returns. Children were also compelled to carry bundles of firewood that were too heavy for them, sweep temples in public, or get wounded with cactus thorns. These actions were rites of correction, not a way to humiliate someone for enjoyment. Furthermore, discipline wasn't negotiable in a society where everyone had a social role. Not even aristocratic kids were exempt. They were actually held to greater standards. A noble youngster might be whipped, tied, or even briefly held as a slave if he disobeyed an adult or instructor. Not forever, but enough to make the lessons painful, both literally and symbolically. Rebellion had actual repercussions if you were raised in an Aztec culture, and you most likely experienced a few weeping, scorching afternoons spent marinating in chili smoke. Hot, indeed. Successful, of course. Nobody forgets their first chili sauna, let's face it. One of the harshest attitudes on stealing in antiquity was held by the Aztec Empire. Stealing was an assault on the social order as well as a moral transgression. Everything had worth, including food, tools, clothing, and firewood. Furthermore, stealing something that wasn't yours not only angered your neighbor, but also the gods. What about the penalty? The Aztecs were not fond of subtlety, to put it mildly. Things got off to a decent start for first-time criminals. A thief may be publicly humiliated, made to return the stolen items, or required to make amends. Maybe a hairstyle that proclaimed, "I steal things," or a couple of lashes. It's painful, but manageable. However, you joined the world of slavery if you stole once more. The Aztecs thought that you literally work off your debt rather than incarcerate people. You could be given to the victim as a personal servant if you are caught a second time. With no dignity left, you would toil in silence, each step telling you that it would have been simpler to be honest. Now things get gory if you were brave or stupid enough to steal a third time. The third punishment was frequently ritual skinning, which was not fast, clean, or private at all. It was ceremonial, slow, and openly presented. This has more to do with symbolism than suffering. The skin was seen as a holy layer and an integral component of one's identity. In the perspective of the community, to take it off was to unmake you. Sometimes the entire skin was taken, and other times it was removed in strips. Furthermore, it wasn't just discarded. As a macabre combination of punishment and rebirth, a priest may even don the skin for a brief period of time during religious ceremonies in honor of the earth goddess. Does that sound awful? The point was that it was. This type of justice focused on the message rather than the individual. In the market plaza, a skinned thief prevented 1,000 more crimes. It caused you to reconsider putting a jade bead in your shirt or swiping tamales. The Aztecs were firm believers in the power of example, law, and consequence, and they had a clear message. We'll alert you if you steal once. You will be worked if you steal twice. You will not need your skin if you steal 3 times. Marriage was a very serious matter in the Aztec Empire, a holy link connected to familial honor, cosmic harmony, and business partnerships, not merely a social contract. Therefore, divorce court was not the consequence for someone who destroyed that tie with a little romantic extracurricular activity. It was blunt object death. Let's start with the fundamentals. Adultery was not considered a personal scandal. It was a capital offense that carried harsh penalties and was prosecuted in public. Men weren't the only ones who could blame others. Women were also capable of accusation. But what if you were apprehended? Therapy was not practiced by the empire. The husband had choices if he was discovered having an affair with another man's wife. And there were no second chances involved. The most typical punishment? Public execution, frequently using a macuahuitl, a hefty tool, to bludgeon the victim. It resembled a sword and had blades of obsidian inlaid in it. However, the harsh version did the job horribly and severely for domestic shame. The courts weren't always left to decide the sentence. The harmed spouse may be able to serve the sentence themselves in some circumstances. Discuss closure. The fates for women who were detected cheating were equally dire. Depending on the area and the specifics of the treachery, death by strangulation, stoning, or being flung from a cliff were all possible outcomes. Naturally, the standards were higher for nobles, because it's more than just scandal when the rich cheat. It could lead to dynastic collapse, not to mention the drama. The accused might be paraded through the streets, ridiculed, shaved and painted before receiving their final sentence if the matter was made public. Shame wasn't a consequence, it was a sentence element. Now it was a different matter entirely if you were wrongfully charged. You could even be put to death for lying about adultery. Character assassination was not accepted by the Aztecs unless it was supported by proof. They also paid attention to what witnesses had to say. In other words, unless you like playing with obsidian, don't start rumors to get even. Aztec marriage was fundamentally a sacred institution. Furthermore, breaking it was more than just a moral lapse. It was an affront to the law, society, and gods. Therefore, the Aztec Empire's answer to the question of whether monogamy was important to ancient societies was yes to death. You've heard of punishment for murder, theft, and even adultery. However, what if the wrong tree is cut down? Certain trees were revered in the Aztec Empire and were more than just leafy wood. They stood for the very harmony of nature, the gods, or the ancestors. Say farewell to your home and perhaps your dignity as well if you, in your amazing wisdom, chose to cut one down for firewood. Some trees were thought to be preserved by divine authority, particularly those that were placed close to temples, marketplaces, or shrines. In addition to being a form of vandalism, damaging someone was considered a spiritual offense. You were insulting the cosmic order in addition to harming nature. The penalty? You may be publicly beaten for a first offense, frequently with prickly branches or cactus spines. Yes, they forced nature to punish you. Prickly-edged poetic justice. It wasn't as bad as that, though. In certain situations, you would also have to make reparation, which may include labor, products, or even the loss of your house. In certain areas, the offending tree cutter was paraded around the town as the locals threw insults and sometimes pebbles at him. Your property could also be taken or destroyed. It was intended to inform everyone, not only to physically harm you. The gardening of the gods was tampered with by this imbecile. What if you committed the same crime again? If the tree you damaged was close to a place of worship, you could be considered a slave. Apparently, you didn't deserve your own roots if you couldn't respect a tree's roots. It might seem ridiculous to ears of today, reprimanded for pruning a branch. The Aztecs, however, took this seriously. Nature wasn't a passive entity. It was sacred, vital, and had a strong spiritual bond. Mountains, rivers, and trees weren't resources. Since they were family, hurting them without their consent would be like slapping your grandmother and hoping no one saw. Therefore, it was necessary to be aware of the laws of botany. If you were a resident of the Aztec kingdom, that tree outside the house of your neighbor, it would be better to ask beforehand. The dubious one in the shop? Don't touch it, please, because ignorance isn't bliss in this world. It's just thorny bruises and incendiary property. Teenage drinking typically results in a lecture, a terrible hangover, or an extremely uncomfortable trip home with your parents in most countries. Throughout the Aztec Empire, the result was execution. Let's clarify one issue. Alcohol was not frowned upon by the Aztecs. The fermented sap of the maguey plant was used to make pulque, a popular and revered beverage. It had a lot of ritual meaning and was foamy and slightly sour. Funeral rites, celebrations, and religious events all made use of pulque. It was seen as divine and therapeutic by adults, particularly priests and elders. One drink, however, was a death sentence for teenagers. It was expected of young Aztecs to be well-behaved, courteous, and completely sober. Pulque was reserved for individuals who had merited it via experience, age, or knowledge. Youth was for education, not for having fun. Teenage drinking was not only frowned upon, but also viewed as a sign of moral decay. Teens who were detected drinking were therefore subject to severe and immediate punishment. A first-time offender may be shamed by being shaved bald. As a mobile reminder that wise decisions are preferable to foolish ones, they were occasionally paraded around the streets nude as the populace threw trash or obscenities at them. However, the penalty quickly increased for repeat offenders. Execution, frequently in public by beating or strangulation. The technique was intended to help with memory, not drama. For a generation, a single adolescent suspended from a pole was sufficient to sober up the entire neighborhood. Not even young people of aristocratic birth were exempt. They were actually held to higher standards. If a prince is detected drinking, he may be sentenced to reside in a chilly, isolated temple or undergo ceremonial humiliation in the royal court. The lesson is that privilege does not justify stupidity. Why so harsh? Because intoxication was viewed by the Aztecs as a form of spiritual decay and a prelude to disdain, disobedience, and sloth. Additionally, a drunken teenager was a ticking time bomb in a society that relied on discipline, order, and cosmic equilibrium. Therefore, keep in mind that your polka cup remained dry unless you were elderly, a high-ranking official, or attending a funeral the next time you envision a crazy Aztec celebration. Your throat wouldn't otherwise. Work was more than just a chore in the Aztec Empire. It was ingrained in the social fabric as a virtue, a holy expectation, and a civic obligation. In the vast cosmic machine, everyone, no matter how high or low, had a part to play. What would have occurred if you hadn't done your share? This is how we should put it. Soon you'll be working again, but not voluntarily. Slacking off, sloth and laziness were not viewed as peculiarities of the personality. They were regarded as transgressions against the gods, especially Tezcatlipoca, who closely monitored moral behavior, and Tlaloc, the god of rain and agriculture. You didn't get good harvests from the gods, so you could take a snooze in the shade. The Aztecs made sure that anyone who disregarded the order of labor would suffer the repercussions. A man might be pulled into the marketplace and publicly humiliated if he refused to work, refused to support his family, or routinely disregarded his civic obligations. His clothing may be changed to rags and his head may be shaved. In certain instances, he would have to carry bundles of firewood or wear rotting clothes while onlookers yelled things like, "Look at the man who does nothing." However, that was the milder variety. Repeat offenders may be chained to a post, whipped with rods, or sold into slavery if their indolence was interpreted as deliberate disobedience. Long enough to learn the lesson, but not forever. Either you're used or you're useful. Even young people of noble birth were under strict observation. A high-ranking young man's family might ask that he be sent to a house of youth, correction, which sounds like summer camp, but was actually more like a military boot camp with cactus punishments if he refused to train for war or ignored temple responsibilities. Women's laziness wasn't disregarded either. Women might be humiliated for neglect even though they had diverse responsibilities, such as caring for the home, weaving, and grinding corn. Mothers were supposed to bring up hard-working kids, not lazy ones that chewed maize husks. Aztec beliefs were straightforward. Harmony is upset by idleness. A lethargic individual jeopardizes the health of their family, the harmony of their community, and the blessings of the gods. Therefore, you had better start running if your intention was to relax around the Chinampa and avoid doing your corn harvesting duties, because it would not be an optional punishment, nor would it be quiet. Everything was negotiable, with the exception of honesty, at the Tianquistli, or marketplace, the vibrant center of the Aztec kingdom. It wasn't only poor business to sell phony obsidian, watered-down pulp or rotten fruit. It was illegal, and the Aztecs did not tolerate any mischief in the marketplace. You weren't merely disobeying the law, you were swindling the gods who favored trade, farming, and just dealing. Every vendor was supposed to follow stringent ethical standards, whether they were selling jade or marketing tamales. Often supervised by special officials known as Pochtecatlatok, or market judges or inspectors, markets were considered hallowed places. What do? Observe people sliding pebbles into their chili powder, stroll around the stalls and listen for grievances. The penalties for selling defective goods were severe and widely known. A first-time infraction could result in public humiliation when your product is strewn around, your stall is toppled, and your hands are bound for everyone to see. Customers would spit comments like, "There goes the liar with wormy avocados," as they passed. It was even worse to sell material that was misrepresented, such as dyed feathers that were marketed as sacred Quetzal plumes. You can be punished with a beating, a fine, or in severe situations, expelled from the market. Banishment was also not a timeout in a society where markets were your lifeline. Economic death was the result. Repeat offenders can be enslaved or marked with a brand to warn prospective customers not to trust your mangoes. You might even be put to death if your fraud resulted in actual harm, such as selling poisonous herbs as medication, particularly if the victim was a person of high rank. It was about preserving confidence, not just about punishing. Families survived, tribute flowed, and communities came together at the market. The entire system would collapse if buyers lost faith in sellers. That was not acceptable. They even kept a tight eye on those who sold idols, incense, religious objects, or ceremonial fabrics. A temple trader who was caught charging exorbitant tribute fees for subpar goods was not just defrauding customers, they were also defrauding the gods. Furthermore, the gods sent diseases rather than refunds. Therefore, if you believed that you could squeak through the market with a corn cob and a nice grin, you were mistaken, because the phrase buyer beware had a very sharp edge in Tenochtitlan. Here is a golden rule to follow if you ever find yourself in an Aztec courtroom surrounded by elders wearing feathered cloaks and awaiting judgment as a priest judge's piercing gaze watches. Take action. No. Tell a lie. Really. Avoid embellishing. Remember not to forget. Furthermore, you should never fabricate your own version of reality. False testimony was not only immoral, but also lethal in the Aztec Empire. Truth was not merely a courtroom etiquette to the Aztecs, it was a fundamental value. Speaking the truth means maintaining harmony, order, and the divine balance. Conversely, lies tainted the social order and angered the gods, particularly the god of truth, judgment, and darkness, Tezcatlipoca. He wasn't impressed by your imaginative narrative. Witness testimony played a major role in court cases. It was just your word against someone else's. There were no forensic labs or security cameras, and it was a really important term. You weren't simply tilting the scales when you lied in court then. You might have wrongly condemned someone to slavery or death. What is the penalty for perjury? Execution. Usually, depending on the area and the degree of your deception, by being strangled, stoning, or clubbed to death. You would frequently be forced to endure the same destiny you brought upon someone else if the falsehood was shown to be true during the trial and their suffering was caused by your deceptive statements. It was sharp-edged poetic justice. There were severe repercussions for even tiny lies. Ritual humiliation, exile, or public beatings might ensue. You may be paraded through the market with a sign around your neck that reads, "Talks too much, tells too little truth." Or you could be painted black, the color of deceit. Lies were not the only punishment meted out to false accusers. They were viewed as dangers to the very fabric of civilization. Willing to incur heavenly wrath, injure others, and sway justice in order to further one's own interests. Aztec law prioritized moral clarity above technicalities. Furthermore, they believed that truth was unchangeable, binding, and sacred. In the event that you were accused of a crime and stood in the plaza believing that a tiny lie would clear your name, what would you do? Keep in mind that the truth could free you under the Aztec Empire. A falsehood, though? You might be buried by it. Although they didn't believe in many of them, the Aztecs did believe in second chances. Although tough, their justice system was not callous. To help you remember the lesson, you could receive a warning, a fine, or a good public whipping for your first offense. If it were your second time, you might have to deal with more severe consequences, such as loss of property, servitude, or public humiliation. However, after a third offense, things were very serious, like ritual execution, serious. Repeated offenses were seen by the Aztecs as evidence that you have refused to live in harmony, not just as a bother. And in the Aztec perspective, equilibrium was crucial. The sun rose because people followed their responsibilities, and the crops thrived because civilization worked. Therefore, persistent lawbreakers posed a threat to cosmic order rather than just being obnoxious. For example, suppose you were a thief. You return the items the first time. You are enslaved for the second time. You're skinned for the third time. Slowly, in public, with the full support of the neighborhood and, perhaps, the law. You might have lied in court, too. once more. The penalty was symbolic, in addition to being more severe than previously. You become inhuman in society as a result of your persistent dishonesty, and those who lose their humanity, what happens to them? They become cautionary tales, cautions, and examples. Furthermore, it involved more than just physical punishment. Repeat offenders may no longer be protected by the law. That implied that anyone may hurt you, enslave you, or embarrass you in public. You also had no legal options. You were not banished. You weren't put in jail. You didn't have a person. A repeat offender may perhaps face permanent exile from the hamlet, the market, or even their own family. Imagine being spiritually wiped because you broke the social contract too many times, not because the gods abandoned you. The Aztecs believed that lawbreakers could be corrected and were not intrinsically bad. Repeat offenders, however, were worse because they were unwilling to learn. Furthermore, in a culture where justice was speedy, public, and divine, the state wasted little time in rehabilitating those who rejected. Therefore, you were fortunate if you were caught once. You were warned twice. However, you were already out of there if you appeared in that courtroom a third time. In contemporary legal systems, punishment frequently takes place in private sessions, courtrooms, and jail cells. However, justice was a form of street play under the Aztec Empire. The purpose of punishment was not just to punish the offender, but also to educate others. For the Aztecs, shame and fear were as useful tools as clubs and cactus whips. Long after the agony subsided, someone would remember your shame and be reluctant to steal that tamale. Because of this, practically all forms of punishment, from flogging to execution, were administered in public, typically in the middle of the neighborhood, outside temples, in the bazaar, or in the square. It was ideal to teach lessons in front of your friends, relatives, and adversaries, because these were the locations where people congregated to trade, pray, and mingle. Consider this. You get caught stealing or lying, they drag you to the square. People start to congregate. Your clothing is ripped. You may have a shaven head. Black soot is painted on you to symbolize your disgrace. The punishment then starts, a thrashing, a binding. If you're still young and careless, perhaps a delicious chili smoking in a hut. Youngsters who disregarded their elders might be forced to walk barefoot throughout town, carrying bulky bundles of wood. Signs might be worn around the necks of lazy employees and paraded. In front of a sea of silent or not so silent onlookers, adulterers could be strangled or stoned. Punishment in public was not arbitrary brutality. It was a memory ritual. Human psychology was understood by the Aztecs. The pain subsides, shame reverberates, and society remained in line because of that echo. There were no lifelong incarcerations or prison systems. Errors were not supposed to vanish. In plain sight, it was to change or destroy them. Even the act of execution was a show. A thief may be flayed in the square where he formerly sold stolen goods, not in some shadowy back room. For all onlookers, his punishment turned into a live tale. Privacy was reserved for the defenseless under Aztec law. It was intended that the guilty be seen, heard, and remembered, not only for their actions, but also for the consequences. Because your true punishment in this world wasn't merely suffering or death, it was turning into the lesson. Punishment under the Aztec kingdom wasn't just based on feelings, it had to do with your representation. For you to be hurt was insufficient. Above all, you needed to be seen, understood, and interpreted. Because Tenochtitlan's justice system was more than just the law. It was a show. How about you? The unfortunate star was you. Suppose you took something, clothing, food, and tools. Perhaps you weren't beaten if it was your first transgression. Rather, you were paraded about in degrading attire, had your head shaved, and had your body painted with black soot. Rags knotted in knots or torn, enormous tunics that made you appear stupid, devastating symbolically but not physically. Say you lied in court, for example. Charcoal may have been used to mark your dishonesty on your lips. It would be visible to all. Everyone would be aware. Telling the truth subsequently didn't matter. The stain was a narrative unto itself. Colors have significance as well. Black was a color linked to dishonesty and humiliation. Red could indicate a major transgression. Clothing with stripes or dyes might be saved for public punishment. The human eye remembers what it has been taught to fear, and the Aztecs knew this. Noble criminals received the same treatment, actually worse. In a blatant reversal of class, a noble youngster caught intoxicated might be clothed like a commoner and made to clean temple floors. That image was potent to an Aztec audience. When the privileged disregard their position, this is what occurs. Even the instruments of punishment were symbolic. There was more to being struck with cactus needles than just the agony. It mirrored the judgment of nature. The weight of guilt was represented by carrying bulky bundles of firewood. Not only did a shaved head seem strange, it indicated that your social dignity had been taken away. The message: crime was not a personal error. A public rupture occurred, a disturbance of the holy stream of order. And society required enduring images in addition to punishments in order to heal it. Living reminders of the close connection between morality and the law. Aztec punishment was essentially a performance. A visual narrative intended to be repeated through song, rumors, and fearful recollections. Not all you were was a criminal. You were a symbol now. Punishment usually results in incarceration in most countries. It's time, constructed walls, a term expressed in years or months. However, there were no jails in the Aztec Empire. Why? Because storing difficulties was not something that the Aztecs believed in. They resolved them fast, in public, and frequently forever. The Aztecs did not view punishment as excluding a person from society. The goal was to put them back in order, or taking them out of the world completely. There was no need to construct a jail, provide food for inmates, or pay for a security system. The consequence was not time, it was death, suffering, or shame. You could be forced to work off your crime and end up in slavery if you stole. However, you did not vanish. You continued to exist in society as a warning. You wore the signs of dishonesty on your body if you lied. Serious offenses were punished quickly in front of the community, and the gods were consulted. And your tale ended if you were unrepentant, a serial criminal, a threat to others, or just plain obstinate. Without parole, in the marketplace, the plaza, or the steps of a temple, not behind an iron-barred door. High-ranking criminals or captured enemy rulers were examples of noble prisoners who were not imprisoned. Until their planned execution or sacrifice, they were kept in temporary, ceremonial captivity and treated according to their status. They didn't get their time, they counted it down. However, there were tiny holding rooms, not jails, but locations to temporarily house someone pending punishment. They weren't used for rehabilitation, were few, and were protected by warriors. They didn't send you there to change, you were told to wait there. Because Aztec justice depended on appearance and immediacy, this method was effective. Punishment that was postponed lost its effect. Similar to incarceration, invisible punishment denied society the lesson, and the lesson was the most significant aspect in Aztec culture. Therefore, the Aztecs created rituals to warn people that breaking the law would have immediate, noticeable, and lasting consequences, whereas other civilizations constructed structures to conceal their crimes. Because bars were unnecessary in this empire, they were balanced. As you have undoubtedly noticed by now, the Aztec Empire was not a firm believer in second chances. Their penalties were quick, symbolic, and frequently excruciating. And the point was precisely that. For the Aztecs, rehabilitation was not the goal of justice. It was a moment of remembering. Every kind of punishment, including being flayed in the street, whipped by a cactus, or placed in a cold smoke sauna, was intended to make the offense ingrained in the collective memory of the community, the offender, and the onlookers. A society devoid of jails depended on something far more robust. The stories that begin with, "You'll never believe what I saw in the marketplace today," are filled with fear, guilt, and other negative emotions. And for that reason, the Aztec legal system was both incredibly powerful and terrifying. People were compelled to remember because they might not live long enough to forget otherwise. Moral clarity was ingrained throughout the entire society. Early on, children were taught that sin produced both suffering and spectacle. Adults understood that criminality was more than a personal failing. There was an imbalance in the cosmos. Long court cases were not what the gods desired. They desired action, and the empire came through. Here's the twist, though. Despite its cruelty, the technique was effective, for them anyway. There was social order, the markets were operating normally, youngsters showed respect. During ceremonies, priests were not pickpocketed, and if you ever considered breaking a rule, you only needed to look at the man limping past you with the shorn head and soot-smeared face to instantly remember the regulations. The Aztecs did more than merely punish, they acted morally. Every crime presented a teaching moment, every outcome was theatrical. You learned by seeing a punishment you would never want to go through yourself, not by reading a scroll. Additionally, the method allowed for the inability to learn. Non-learners were turned into warnings in a world without permanent imprisonment. Either you didn't live long enough to transgress the rules again, or you recalled them. That was Aztec justice, quick, symbolic, and memorable in every aspect that was important. Chota was a woman negotiating the harsh politics of a burgeoning Illyrian kingdom before she became the bane of Roman traders and the embodiment of sea-born rebellion. Her throne was not peacefully inherited, she wed it. Tuta entered a society ruled by warlords, smugglers, and marine raiders as the spouse of King Agron of the Adii tribe, one of the most potent Illyrian coalitions on the eastern Adriatic coast. Agron was a powerful monarch who was well known for his expansionist policies and military aspirations. Illyria developed into a formidable naval force under his command. However, depending on which old rumors you accept, his unexpected death in 231 BCE from disease or possibly a drinking spree placed the throne in a vulnerable position, and Tuta took over as the regent commander for her little stepson, Pinnes, rather than as a distraught widow. This role was not ceremonial. Tuta did not wait for advisors while seated behind silk drapes. She assumed control of the fleet and, more significantly, of the government. At the time of her leadership, piracy was not only accepted, it was almost a national hobby. To their own people, Illyrian pirates were not criminals. They served as the foundation of the community's economy. They controlled important commercial routes through the Adriatic and Ionian seas, plundered merchant ships, and demanded tribute. Piracy not only persisted but flourished under Tuta's rule. She vigorously defended it, legalized it, and supported it. It was an acceptable kind of warfare to her, and it was a respectable career for many Illyrians. Tuta was aware of her actions. She perceived a void in a world where Rome had not yet reached the other side of the sea, and Athens had faded, and she filled it with Illyrian sails. Even while she might have controlled the Adriatic, her audacity would soon incite a power that disliked maritime meddling. Rome watched, extending its reach slowly but steadily. Furthermore, Tuta's rule would no longer be a regional issue, as Illyrian piracy permeated Roman commercial lines. The Romans determined that a very permanent solution was necessary, and it would turn into an international issue. A giant had been awakened by the Queen of the Sea and Rocks. The pirates of Tuta were not merely robbing lone trade vessels, they were attacking Greek cities that were protected by the Romans, attacking Roman convoys, and even pillaging ports on the western coast. This was not piracy to Rome, it was offensive, Furthermore, Romans were not known for ignoring insults. Roman senators had had enough by 230 BCE. In a warning disguised as diplomacy but with a sword behind the back, the Senate sent a formal diplomatic mission to Tutor's palace. Lucius Coruncanius, a Roman who served as the principal diplomat, was notoriously direct. He gave explicit directions. Rome would intervene if you told the Illyrian queen to put an end to the piracy. Scodra, Tutor's capital, was probably where the group was greeted upon arrival. Picture the scene: marble columns, helmeted Illyrian guards, and a queen sitting in complete control rather than fear. Tutor greeted them. Rome, however, responded coldly when they brought her the message. She responded to them in a way that only a salt-blooded ruler might. She asserted that Illyrian kings had always allowed their followers to earn a living as they wished, including by piracy, in her own words as later documented by Roman historians. In essence, she informed Rome that she had no control over what transpired at sea. Rome didn't desire that response. Then a deadly error occurred. Perhaps inspired by Roman pride or simply conceitedness, one of the Roman envoys publicly attacked Tutor. By acting like a woman, he implied that she was emotional, weak, and unsuited to be in a position of authority. That comment cost him his life, whether it was due to misogyny, poor diplomacy, or just plain ignorance. Shortly thereafter, he was killed on Tutor's instructions, a decision that would reverberate across the Roman Senate's marble floors. Outrage erupted in Rome. A Roman envoy's murder was more than just a diplomatic lapse. It was an act of war, and a very specific kind. Rome's first military expedition over the Adriatic would mark the start of its eastern Mediterranean expansion. Tutor had taken the initiative. She had gone too far, whether it was out of pride, policy, or just plain rage. Rome was approaching now, but with legions rather than envoys. There would be no more warnings. The Queen had aroused the fury of the Republic. Even Tutor might have misjudged the size and quickness of the Roman counterattack, but she probably recognized that Rome's retribution wouldn't be little. Rome launched its first ever military campaign across the Adriatic Sea in 229 BCE, just 1 year after their envoy was assassinated. It was chillingly efficient, well-organized, and quick. A fleet of more than 200 ships, larger than any Illyria had ever seen, was sent with 2 consuls. This was no ordinary border battle or raid. The invasion was full-scale. As regent and supreme commander of the navy, Tutor did her utmost to train her army. Despite her nautical prowess and ferocious warriors, Illyria was a patchwork of tribes. Rome was a machine. The Romans wasted no time. They began by attacking the coastal Greek city-states that Illyrian armies had seized or harassed. After being taken by Illyrian pirates, Corcyra, or modern-day Corfu, was freed by the Romans and converted into a naval base. Epidamnus and Apollonia soon complied with Roman protection. It was an obvious message. The playground of Illyria would no longer be the Adriatic. Tutor, however, wasn't hiding. Illyrian pirates kept attacking where they could, and she dispatched her navy to protect the coasts. But things were changing. The Romans took a fortress for each attack they conducted. Despite being unfamiliar with the eastern seas, the Roman fleet was brutal and quickly picking things up. More Illyrian allies started to give up as Rome gained ground. In an attempt to gain leniency, cities that had previously looked to Tutor for leadership now welcomed Rome. The allegiance she had previously engendered as the pirate queen started to wane, particularly as Roman troops moved inland and forced the populace to choose between surviving and standing with a besieged queen. By the end of the year, Scodra, the capital of Tutor, was within striking distance of Roman forces. A queen defending her people's way of life, which had begun as a defiant act, was quickly turning into a siege. Tutor now had to choose between submitting to a foreign power or fighting to the end and risking annihilation, a choice no king ever likes to make. The hostile sails now approached the queen who had commanded the waves. Both her and Illyria's futures were on the line. Forget, Tutor's once powerful influence started to wane like a tide as Scodra and her allies fell one by one as Roman armies closed in on them. Under Roman pressure, her network of coastal strongholds, which were essential for raiding and resupplying ships, was disintegrating. Once an Illyrian domain, the Adriatic Sea was suddenly teeming with Roman warships. Tutor was no fool, yet the Sea Queen had lost her sea. Even though she was a defiant ruler, she knew when to give in, particularly when it came to survival. Despite the enormous obstacles, the proud pirate queen achieved what nobody expected her to do in 228 BCE. She filed a peace suit. The purpose of the negotiations was humiliation. Rome wants to use her as an example. They insisted that she cede the majority of the Illyrian coastline, turn over important forts, and, most painfully, leave her cherished navy. Only a tiny inland area of her old kingdom was given to Tutor to govern, and even then she was required to swear that she would never use more than 2 unarmed ships to travel farther ashore. 2 ships without weapons. This was a symbolic castration for a woman who had formerly commanded fleets. The Adriatic now responded to Rome, the sea was no longer hers, and the title of Pirate Queen had been compelled to be resigned. However, Tutor was not entirely broken, even in surrender. She lost her military influence and political clout, but she kept her title and briefly held the position of regent. Her ability to literally weather the storm demonstrated the shrewdness and practicality that had characterized her reign. Tutor was spared in a world where other dissident kings were frequently put to death or brought in chains by Roman victories. Maybe Rome admired her perseverance, or maybe they were afraid of making her a martyr. Nevertheless, her impact swiftly diminished. Shortly after the peace deal, Tutor vanishes from history. In the end, her stepson Pines would hold nominal authority, but always under Roman supervision. Once a queen who commanded troops and seas, Tutor vanished into obscurity. She was not forgotten, however. She was the first to challenge them on the wide sea, according to Roman memory. She also continued to be a symbol of resistance in Illyrian folklore, a lady who dared to oppose a growing empire and almost got away with it. Even though Tutor's reign came to an end with her capitulation, her legacy helped pave the way for one of the most significant shifts in Mediterranean history, the rise of Rome as a naval powerhouse. Ironically, Rome had to change because of her defiance. Rome had been predominantly a land-based power prior to Tutor. Its legions provided its military might, the landowners provided its political clout, and the Italian peninsula remained its primary emphasis. The ocean? That was reserved for Greeks and traders, or pirates like as the Illyrians. Tutor, however, altered that. Her valiant resistance and the murder of a Roman messenger led to Rome's first significant conflict across the Adriatic, the First Illyrian War. Building fleets, figuring out maritime routes, and figuring out how to live in and run coastal communities were all necessary. This was no short-term mission. An initiation took place. Rome wasn't the only thing Tutor enraged. Rome took notes as she made them enlarge. They did not abandon the pirate system after it was overthrown. They swapped it out. Rome secured commercial routes that had previously been vulnerable to Tutor's raids by establishing protectorates along the Greek and Illyrian shores after their victory. They established enduring influence, gathered tribute, and installed kind kings. Once Illyrian blue, the Adriatic now glistened with Roman ships. It's simple to forget how important this is. However, without Tutor and the crisis she sparked, Rome might not have developed into a naval powerhouse at such a young age. Inadvertently, she was a catalyst. Her collapse signaled a strategic change in Roman foreign policy, from defending borders to crossing them. Her aggression sparked invention, and her resistance sparked a metamorphosis. She didn't do this voluntarily, of course. Teaching Rome how to establish an empire was never one of Tutor's objectives. She was striving to maintain her power in a world dominated by men, to defend the freedom of her people, and to legitimize Illyrian seafaring. However, her opponents would write her legacy, just like so many other historical characters caught in the whirlpool of empire. Nevertheless, one cannot not but question if the Republic would have crossed the Adriatic so quickly if Tutor had not opposed Rome. Or would another generation have seen it remain a landlocked empire? History is a cunning manipulator, and even hesitant revolutionaries are remembered because of Tutor's acts, which altered the map. In addition to pirates and power struggles, Tutor's story also deals with gender. She was more than just a monarch. She was a woman in charge of a harsh, male-dominated society where authority was typically acquired via heredity, or, ideally, both. Nevertheless, here was Tutor leading fleets, deciding diplomatically, carrying out envoys, and starting global conflicts. Female leaders were not treated well in the ancient world. Roman and Greek chroniclers, in particular, frequently used caricature when women had power. Boudica was wild, while Cleopatra was sensual. What about Tutor? At least to Roman historians, she was crazy and dangerous. Polybius, for instance, he characterizes Tutor as a woman who has a sex-related vulnerability by nature. You can sense what she was up against just from that statement. Roman authors attributed it to female feeling rather than political astuteness, because they could not comprehend that a woman had incited their republic to war and then defended her position for over a year. Let's break through the antiquated propaganda, though. It was neither scandal nor seduction that brought Tutor to power. She achieved this via survival and planning. After her husband passed away, she inherited a precarious monarchy, which she was able to hold on to despite political unrest. Peace was not inherited by her. She inherited unfriendly neighbors, tribal strife, and piracy. And those ingredients were like weapons in her hands. Was she cruel? Most likely. But so were the majority of the era's kings. She wasn't acting hysterically when she executed the Roman envoy. It was a deliberate, albeit dangerous, political statement. She was using force, the only method she knew of, to protect Illyrian sovereignty. And keep in mind that Tutor's people did not topple her. She wasn't killed in palace intrigue or betrayed in a coup. Rome's superior force caused her to lose, that's all. She did not face opposition from her people. Long after she gave up, some of her supporters actually rebelled against Rome. Even though Tutor's reign was brief, it left her mark on a society that hardly ever allowed for women in positions of authority. Even though their historians attempted to dismiss her, she pushed them to take her seriously by going up against the most powerful nation of the day. She was a woman who unnerved the ancient world, a queen in battle and a ruler in times of distress. Tutor's story refused to fade under the waves, even if her reign came to an end in a humbled peace. Legends continued to chant her name throughout the Adriatic coast for centuries after her last ship was grounded and her voice died. Her reputation as a vanquished regent was replaced in Illyria by something much more timeless, a representation of feminine authority, resistance, and patriotism. Tutor evolved into more than just a queen, particularly in Albanian folklore. She stood alone against the growing tide of alien dominance as the rebellious matriarch of a people. Her name was transmitted orally by shepherds and sailors rather than through dusty treaties. Some rulers outlived their empires, as evidenced by the bronze statues of her that today survive in Montenegro and modern Albania. And it was an empire. Although Illyria was never as large or as well developed as Rome, it did control important sea passages and coastal cities during Tuta's rule. She held power during one of the final eras in which Illyrian identity was still politically autonomous. Rome started assimilating Illyrian culture, language, and government gradually and relentlessly after she fell. Tuta's capitulation signaled the start of the end for Illyrian sovereignty, as well as the conclusion of a war. However, Tuta's memory endured as Rome buried her realm beneath prefectures and provinces. Despite its short duration, her rule served as a focal point for upcoming generations looking for motivation. As Balkan nationalism grew in the 19th and 20th centuries, and nations like Albania started creating new identities based on their old heritage, Tuta was resurrected as a hero rather than a sorrowful character. Schools and streets were named after her, and textbooks lauded her bravery. She was now an ancestor of defiance rather than merely a queen. Her account still sparks controversy in contemporary scholarship. Was she a pragmatist compelled to accept piracy as state policy, or was she a careless pirate? Did her husband's death and the aspirations of an empire push her into a corner, or was she a tyrant? Regardless of the facts, Tuta holds a unique place in ancient history as a woman who refused to take responsibility for her authority and whose choices, for better or worse, changed the course of an entire sea. Even if her ships were destroyed, her legend endures. It's easy to understand why Tuta's historical fact gradually gave way to mythology, a character who is half tale and half truth, a queen who ruled a kingdom by the sea, led pirates, disobeyed Rome, and vanished from history without explanation. Legends are created of things like that, tales of a queen who formerly ruled from a tall castle by the sea are still told in coastal communities like Ulkinj and Kotor. Even when archaeology provides scant evidence, locals would point to crumbling ruins and claim that was Tuta's fortress. According to legend, she cursed the rivers that betrayed her, buried gold in secret island caverns, and threw herself from cliffs to evade Roman arrest. Since Tuta was no longer merely a human, none of it has ever truly needed to be verified, yet none of it can be. She turned into a symbol, and symbols are impervious to defeat. Her presence seems to reverberate even in the waves. The name Queen Tuta is inscribed on contemporary hotels, cruise ships, and cultural events, while contemporary feminists in the Balkans hail her as an early symbol of female leadership. Romantic writers saw her as a tragic heroine. She has been warmly welcomed, especially in Albania. Public spaces are now adorned with statues of Tuta, who is frequently shown with her hair blown in the wind and a sword by her side. Alongside Skanderbegs, schoolchildren learn her name. The actual Tuta, the woman who created the myth, is still elusive, though. We have no idea how she passed away. Whether she ever felt bad about opposing Rome is unknown to us. Even what she looked like is unknown to us. Others, frequently her adversaries, shaped her image, and others who needed her as a legend later changed it. But perhaps when your story defies historical precedent, that's the sign of genuine influence. Even though Tuta was only in power for a few years, her legacy endures for decades. Throughout the Adriatic coast, she is remembered through poetry, place names, and oral traditions. Now only textbooks and ruins remain of the Roman Empire that once attempted to eradicate her. However, Tuta continues to sail in memory. The pirate queen evolved into an immortal being. Tuta's name has resonance today that goes well beyond the pages of antiquity. Her narrative has become a cultural and national icon, not merely a historical curiosity, and it has been borrowed, altered, and echoed in ways she could never have predicted. She stands for something essential in Albania, Montenegro, and throughout the Western Balkans. the stubborn independence of a people that resisted being absorbed by empires. In an area that has endured centuries of conflict, division, and occupation, her story is powerful. Tuta has evolved into more than just a queen, particularly among Albanians. She represents a sense of national pride. Her memory has fueled opposition to foreign dominance and inspired pride in a pre-Roman Illyrian history, and it has been intertwined into the cultural revival movements of the 19th and 20th centuries. With its roots in stone, salt, and defiance, Tuta remains a constant in a world where borders have changed innumerable times, and languages and allegiances have become hazy. Her name appears on everything from passenger ferries and navy ships to sports teams, companies, and even a women's football squad. She is taught in schools as a national hero. Harbours once dominated by Tuta's fleet are overlooked by statues of her, sword in hand, gaze fixed on the horizon. She is now the immortal protector of the Adriatic, a monarch of both the past and the present. Her importance transcends national boundaries. Tuta has evolved into an archaic case study in the larger discussion of women in leadership roles. Her narrative provides a unique look at female leadership in a setting and era where it was practically unheard of. She questions contemporary notions of gender and power in antiquity. Today, her name is mentioned with those of Cleopatra, Boudica, and Zenobia, women who dared to rule in a society dominated by men and left an empire in their wake. Perhaps the most amazing aspect is that a woman who was so poorly chronicled by her peers, and who was mostly remembered by the taunts of Roman authors today, stands tall as a symbol of brave opposition, empowerment, and sovereignty. Despite her brief reign, Tuta's name endures for generations, and every port that honors her, and every tale told to children about the queen who resisted Rome, Tuta continues to sail on, not in battleships but in remembrance. The story was her enduring throne, and the sea was her country. One of the most incredible real estate transactions in history was made in the United States in 1803. President Thomas Jefferson purchased the Louisiana Territory, a vast tract of land from France, with a single stroke of his pen and $15 million. This was more than 800,000 square miles of unexplored wilderness that stretched from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains and beyond, not just a few acres outside of New Orleans. Jefferson was ecstatic because the land would guarantee space for westward migration and guarantee authority over important commerce routes. One minor issue, though, was that no one truly knew what was out there. There were hazy maps, tales of woolly mammoths, enormous mountains, a supposed northwest route to Asia, and river systems that could lead you to the Pacific or nowhere. Jefferson wanted to quickly transform that blank map into something concrete and genuine because he needed answers. In order to investigate the new area, map its topography, build relationships with local tribes, and hopefully discover a direct waterway to the Pacific Ocean, he came up with a strategy and sent a small, elite crew west. Meriwether Lewis, Jefferson's personal secretary, a former army captain, and a person with an unquenchable interest in science and nature, was chosen for this extraordinary duty. Lewis then selected William Clark, a longtime friend, veteran of the armed forces, and accomplished outdoor enthusiast, to co-lead the expedition. Lewis and Clark had contrasting personalities. Lewis was serious and introverted, while Clark was gregarious, solid, and pragmatic. However, when combined, they were a perfect equilibrium. Information gathering, not conquest, was their goal. Everything from plants and animals to rivers, rocks, and languages was to be noted. They combined the skills of explorers, naturalists, and diplomats. To be clear, though, this was no walk in the woods. They would traverse wild rivers, thick woods, blazing plains, and snow-capped mountains during the voyage. There were only handwritten journals, unwavering resolve, and the hope that the Pacific was somewhere in the western fog. There were no lifelines, no GPS, and no supply depots. The stage was so prepared, With just their bravery and a president's order, 2 men were set to tackle the great enigma that a young nation had brought. Lewis and Clark required a team, and not just any group of adventurers, before they could venture into the wilderness. They required men who could hunt their own food, fix damaged equipment, row upstream for weeks, fight if necessary, and live in close quarters without privacy for years. To put it briefly, men who are resilient enough to endure everything. The Corps of Discovery would be the name given to this exclusive corps. The recruitment process started in the winter of 1803-1804. On the eastern bank of the Mississippi River, just north of St. Louis, Lewis and Clark established Camp Dubois. They would use it as a staging ground and training facility. Their main sources of recruits were disciplined troops, tough frontiersmen, military outposts, and proficient riflemen. The majority were unmarried, in their 20s and full of adventure. Men like John Ordway, a tough but competent sergeant who assisted in enforcing discipline, and George Drouillard, a superb tracker and interpreter, were among them. An oath to the expedition was taken by each recruit. This was not merely a reconnaissance team. It represented the aspirations of a developing country and was a branch of the U.S. government. Every man had a part to perform, but Lewis and Clark would take the lead. To assist raise spirits, they added carpenters, hunters, cooks, blacksmiths, and even musicians. Supplies were just as important. A specially constructed keelboat with a sail, oars, and a cabin was loaded by the crew. In addition to medical supplies, scientific instruments, muskets, gunpowder, and more than 200 pounds of ink and paper for notebooks, they also brought trade goods to give native tribes, including beads, knives, mirrors, peace medals featuring Jefferson's likeness, and more. Throughout the winter, the soldiers drilled every day. They worked on their marksmanship, portaging, sailing, and rowing skills. They learnt to trust their captains, to obey commands, and to live together. Strict discipline was used. Flogging might result from desertion, but their newfound solidarity would serve as their most powerful tool for the voyage ahead. The Corps was ready by May 1804. With more than 40 men, they rowed up the Missouri River against the flow and into a territory that few Americans had ever seen. It was the start of a trip that would ultimately lead them to the destination, or so they hoped, across mountain ranges and tribal nations. The Corps of Discovery formally left Camp Dubois on May 14, 1804, and started rowing up the Missouri River, which is the longest river in North America. Although the soldiers on board had no idea how long it would last or what they would encounter, it was the beginning of something epic for them. The maps were blank, the landscape was unmapped, and everything depended on conjecture. The expedition's initial phase proved exhausting. The powerful river of the Missouri worked against them. Hours of backbreaking labor were required every day to hoist sails when the wind cooperated, push poles into the riverbed, or pull ropes from the riverbanks. Swarms of insects, sandbars, submerged logs, and the intense summer heat were all present. However, Lewis and Clark made it apparent early on that this was a scientific expedition rather than merely a journey. They carefully documented observations, animal behaviors, plant types, weather patterns, and river conditions every evening. They used sextants and chains to measure distances and drew maps. They were recording the new American frontier, not merely exploring it. The Corps traveled through areas that were inhabited by many Native American tribes who had lived there for many centuries and were familiar with the plains and rivers. Near modern-day Nebraska, the expedition had its first significant encounter with the Otto and Missouri tribes. The meeting was important, tactful, and official. While Lewis articulated the United States' new claims over the region, a notion that many leaders found dubious, Clark offered gifts and medals, but for the time being, diplomacy won out. The Corps continued. Wildlife evolved into a wonder and a danger. The Americans had never seen grizzly bears before, and they turned out to be far more hostile than they had expected. The men were continually plagued by swarms of mosquitoes and gnats. Herds of bison roared across the grasslands. Lewis was so awed by prairie dogs, which Easterners had never seen before, that he attempted to transport one of them back to Jefferson alive. After 5 exhausting months on the river, they arrived in the Mandan and Hidatsa settlements in modern-day North Dakota by October 1804. The Corps constructed Fort Mandan there and got ready to spend the winter among the tribes as the snow started to fall and the Missouri iced over. The most difficult portion of their voyage was still to come, even though they had already traveled hundreds of kilometers. Both the wide unknown beyond and the Rocky Mountains were waiting. The Corps of Discovery spent the winter at Fort Mandan, a rudimentary but solid log building constructed close to the Mandan and Hidatsa tribes' villages, as the Missouri River froze and the snow thickened. By late 1804, the temperature had dropped much below zero. Throughout the season, the crew fixed equipment, replenished supplies, and engaged with the indigenous tribes, whose hospitality and wisdom would be vital. The Hidatsa and Mandan were seasoned farmers and traders. Their kindness allowed the Corps to exist, and their towns were a hive of activity even during the dead of winter. In addition, the two tribes possessed intelligence, which was even more valuable than food. They talked about mountains in the future, far-off rivers, and a mysterious people known as the Shoshone who lived close to the western edge of the known world. Lewis and Clark were in dire need of finding this tribe because they needed horses, and the Shoshone were known to have them if they had any chance of making it across the Rockies and to the Pacific. Sacagawea then comes into the narrative at this point. Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian fur trapper, was employed by Lewis and Clark as an interpreter during their visit. He arrived with his young wife, Sacagawea, a Shoshone lady who had been sold to Charbonneau after being abducted as a young girl. Despite being pregnant and still a teenager, Sacagawea soon demonstrated that she was much more than just the trapper's bride. She gave birth to a son, Jean-Baptiste, who Clark dubbed Pomp, in February 1805. 2 months later, with her baby on her back, Sacagawea and the Corps began their westward trek. The trip was changed by her presence. She was able to interact with Shoshone bands they would later come across in the first place as an interpreter. Second, she was somewhat familiar with the terrain. Third, and maybe most significantly, she was a symbol. To the tribes they encountered along the road, a lady bearing a baby was a sign of peace. Families were not brought by war parties. With improved maps, more robust supplies, and a renewed sense of hope, the Corps of Discovery departed Fort Mandan in April 1805. There were raging rivers, tall mountains, and obstacles they had never encountered before. Now, however, they possessed Sacagawea, a silent power that would influence the course of their expedition. The Missouri River started to shift in the spring of 1805 as the Corps of Discovery advanced farther into the continent. The muddy, broad river became increasingly tumultuous as it twisted through steep valleys and contracted. The beautiful countryside that surrounded them has changed. It was wild, rough, and rising. The terrain was shifting against the expedition as they entered the upper Missouri Basin. The Great Falls of the Missouri, one of their most formidable physical obstacles, soon came into view. Lewis had expected a single waterfall, but instead they encountered 5, a 21-mile challenge of cascades and rapids. In a harsh portage, the Corps had to transport supplies and boats across arid terrain. It required more than a month of grueling work. The guys dragged massive boats over undulating terrain with homemade wheels, hauling tons of cargo across fields of prickly pear cactus and hordes of biting insects. The portage was a turning moment despite the difficulties. The expedition's direction was verified by the falls. Reaching the falls confirmed that the legendary Northwest Passage, if it existed, might be just beyond, as the falls had been referenced in native chronicles. However, they were unable to find an easy way west along the river. Rather, it took them directly into the Stony Mountains. The Corps arrived at the Missouri's Three Forks, where the Jefferson, Madison, and Gallatin rivers divide, by August 1805. In an attempt to locate Sacagawea's folks, they traced her early memories down the Jefferson River. They soon came across a tiny Shoshone tribe, and in a remarkable turn of events, the chief was Kamawate, Sacagawea's own brother. The timing of the tearful reunion couldn't have been more ideal. The Corps obtained horses and escorts through Sacagawea and her newly acquired tribe's trust, which were necessary for the subsequent portion of the expedition. With the help of the Shoshone and horses, it was now feasible to traverse the Rockies, reviving the hope of a waterway to the Pacific. Although the river had taken them a long way, the mountains were now going to put them to the test, and the upcoming weeks would turn out to be the most taxing of the entire journey. Now that the hope of a waterway northwest passage had been put to rest and Shoshone horses were safe, the Corps of Discovery prepared for their next and most difficult challenge, traversing the Bitterroot Mountains, a snow-covered range in western Idaho and Montana that gave the appearance of mercy to the Rockies. This was now survival rather than exploration. In September 1805, just as the first snowstorms came, Lewis and Clark led their men into the Bitterroot's high passes under the guidance of the Shoshone and then the Nez Perce. Steep, narrow, and covered with snow, the path was a nightmare. The men's hands and faces were damaged from the cold as they slipped down icy pathways. There was nothing for them to hunt. The guys were forced to eat candles, animal hide soup, and any roots they could find since their horses were starving to death. They occasionally had trouble moving a mile a day. The Corps was in danger of disintegrating by the time they entered Nez Perce country. They were fatigued, malnourished, and barely surviving. The Nez Perce had the numbers and the element of surprise to attack them, but the tribe decided to show mercy instead. The men were given dried salmon and Karma's root by the Nez Perce, who also assisted in their recuperation. It was a turning point. The party might have perished there, buried in a mountain pass, had it not been for the Nez Perce. Lewis and Clark constructed fresh dugout canoes and stashed their horses after they recovered. They would be transported the remainder of the way to the Pacific by the rivers, which are today the Clearwater, the Snake, and finally the powerful Columbia. However, they now had knowledge that they did not have at the beginning. The continent could not be reached directly by water. Generations of explorers had hoped for the Northwest Passage, but it never existed. The continent is divided in half by the mountains. They had crossed, though. The Corps continued, racing against the impending winter and overcoming new hazards and waterways. However, spirits were soaring once more. The smell of the ocean was no longer a fantasy because they had survived the worst that nature could provide. Just ahead, it was genuine. Chapter 7. Arriving at the Pacific. After months of adversity, the Corps of Discovery finally made it out of the untamed interior in October 1805 and started to descend the Columbia River, which would eventually take them to the Pacific Ocean. They were moving downstream for the first time in more than a year. The terrain was shifting, the forests were denser, the rivers were teeming with salmon, and the air was more humid. However, things weren't always easy. Despite its grandeur, the Columbia was dangerous. Navigation was hazardous due to whirlpools, jagged rocks, and rapids. A single mistake may destroy a canoe and send personnel or supplies to the bottom. A number of boats overturned. There was a loss of equipment. Nevertheless, the Corps persisted because they were closer to their objective and were motivated by something more powerful than fear. They traveled through areas that were home to numerous and strong tribes, including the Walla Walla, Yakama, Chinook, and others. Diplomacy and trade persisted. Tensions occasionally increased, particularly when the Corps' military discipline conflicted with tribal norms. However, there were no conflicts, and numerous tribes traded trinkets, knives, or Jefferson's silver peace medals for information, fish, and roots. Then they spotted it in the middle of November 1805, the Pacific Sea. More accurately, they witnessed the estuary of the Columbia River, roiling with storm winds and tidal surges. "Ocean in view" is what Clark wrote in his journal. Oh, the happiness! They had succeeded. The Corps of Discovery arrived at the furthest western end of the continent after traveling almost 4,000 miles over plains, rivers, and mountains. However, the Pacific didn't exactly give them a warm welcome. It was a wretched coastal winter when the Corps arrived. For weeks it rained, the winds roared, there weren't many supplies, they were wet and cold men. Finding food was more difficult than anticipated, and dealing with the indigenous tribes was challenging. After voting on where to spend the winter, the Corps, which included Sacagawea and Clark's black slave York, finally decided on a protected location south of the river. Fort Clatsop, located close to present-day Astoria, Oregon, was constructed there. For the next 4 months, they would stay there, making maps, recording coastal animals, and getting ready for the arduous trip home. The most dangerous aspect of the job was yet to come, but it was already half done, returning, alive. The Corps of Discovery packed up their equipment, burnt what they couldn't carry, and headed east in March 1806, following 4 bone-chilling rainy months at Fort Clatsop. Although they had reached the Pacific, returning home would not be a victory lap. The voyage back was just as difficult as the one to the west. The spring rains converted trails to mud, their clothes were ragged, and their provisions were few. Once more, the Clatsop, Nez Perce, and Walla Walla were among the native tribes who helped them survive by trading what little they had left for food, horses, and guidance. It was just as terrible to cross the Bitterroot Mountains again. There was little game, and the upper passes were still covered in snow. The males had greater experience, but they were also thinner, hungrier, and more worn out. Blind guesswork has given way to guided instinct. Lewis and Clark divided the Corps into 2 sections to continue exploring after crossing the divide. In an attempt to clarify the northern limits of the Louisiana Purchase, Lewis headed north toward the Marias River. The sole violent altercation of the entire voyage occurred when his troop ran upon hostile Blackfeet warriors. Following their attempts to steal horses and firearms, 2 young Blackfeet were slain in a skirmish. In the meantime, Clark's team followed the Yellowstone River, naming monuments and creating new routes. One such landmark is the well-known Pompey's Pillar, which still has Clark's name engraved on it. The 2 groups met up again at the Missouri River in the late summer of 1806. The mood was upbeat. The terrain seemed smaller now. Once unknown landmarks were now well known. News swiftly spread when they arrived to Missouri's settled edge. They had returned alive. On September 23, 1806, the Corps was welcomed back to St. Louis like heroes. It has been more than 2 years since they left. A lot of people had thought they were dead. However, they brought back diaries, maps, 178 new species of plants and animals, and comprehensive data on dozens of indigenous groups. More significantly, they demonstrated that it was possible to cross the continent. The homecoming of Lewis and Clark wasn't only the conclusion of a voyage for a young country still figuring out who it was. A boundary was being established. An epic expedition came to an end with the Corps of Discovery's return, but its legacy also began. They praised Lewis and Clark as national heroes. They received recognition for their journals. The American westward expansion was based on their maps. What they brought back was far more valuable than the fact that they had failed to discover a continuous maritime path to the Pacific. An accurate depiction of the large, affluent, and intricate American West. President Jefferson was ecstatic. The expedition had achieved its goal and more. The scientific specimens were impressive in and of themselves. Washington received living creatures such as prairie dogs and magpies, as well as plants, animals, and fossils. Future explorers and decision-makers found the in-depth descriptions of indigenous countries, their traditions, languages, and political systems to be crucial reading. However, things didn't end so well for Lewis and Clark. William Clark had a lengthy career in public service. He was appointed Superintendent of Indian Affairs and Governor of the Missouri Territory. Throughout his life, he interacted with native tribes, sometimes as a friend, and other times as an enforcer of U.S. expansion. He also reared Sacagawea's son, Jean-Baptiste, also known as Pomp. But Meriwether Lewis had trouble. He was beset by political strife, debt, and deteriorating mental health after being appointed governor of the Louisiana Territory. Lewis passed away along the Natchez Trace in Tennessee in 1809, just 3 years after the voyage, under unexplained circumstances that most certainly involved suicide. He was only 35. Regarding Sacagawea, there is still some mystery surrounding her post-expedition life. Although some oral tales claim she lived much longer, records indicate she passed away young, in 1812. It is evident that her presence was crucial. The Corps might not have survived the Rockies or won the confidence of important tribes without her. Even though she wasn't always given full credit in the history books, her grit, perseverance, and quiet brilliance altered the course of the trip. Americans' perceptions of their nation were altered by the call of discovery. They demonstrated how big, linked, and already home to a variety of independent countries the continent was. They paved the way for a torrent of settlers, troops, and aspirants in the near future. It wasn't just new territory that Lewis and Clark explored. It would never be the same as they stood on the precipice of something much bigger, the destiny of the United States. There is a world etched in silence beneath the bustling bustle of Istanbul and the thundering footsteps of tourists, a world that once, drop by drop, sustained the Byzantine Empire. It's known as the Basilica Cistern, and if you didn't know where to look, you might not realize that an old water cathedral is still alive beneath the cobblestone streets and bustle of contemporary life. The cistern is more than just a storage tank. It was constructed in the 6th century under Emperor Justinian I. It is a palace that has been inverted. It was concealed beneath the city's foundations and covered an area of more than 9,800 square meters, holding up to 80,000 cubic meters of water. This was more than simply a pit, though. This was architecture, style, a hidden wonder created with intention and ambition. After a devastating fire and several uprisings rocked the city, Justinian ordered its construction. Water shortages were unaffordable for his empire, which was already damaged by riots and pestilence, neither for its palaces, nor for its public baths, or its populace. The purpose of the cistern was to guarantee existence by providing Constantinople with a hidden source of water during periods of uncertainty and siege. Perhaps the Basilica Cistern style, more than its size, is what makes it so magnificent. The arched ceiling is held up like quiet sentinels by 336 marble columns, each about 9 meters high. Many were taken from ancient pagan temples and used for other purposes. Their disparate styles allude to the hurry and improvisation that went along with their installation. The temperature drops when you enter the chamber after descending the stone stairway. The air retains moisture. Beneath wooden walks, the water's surface ripples softly, and all around you, amber-lit columns are adorned with dancing shadows. This wasn't supposed to be seen. However, it was constructed with such respect for form that its grandeur is comparable to that of any basilica that is above ground. It is an upside-down cathedral that was built to house the most important gift from the earth, not to honor the heavens. Centuries of conflict, empire, and religion changed above. The Basilica Cistern, however, remained below in the silence and the darkness, concealed, preserved, and prepared to be rediscovered by a world that had forgotten what was beneath its feet. Water was more than just a need in the center of ancient Constantinople. It was survival, sovereignty, and strategy. Although it wasn't the only reservoir in the city, the basilica cistern was one of the biggest and most important. Aqueducts that stretched miles from far-off springs in the Belgrade forest, like the imposing Valens Aqueduct, supplied water to the vast palace of Constantinople. Hundreds of thousands of people lived in the city, which was huge for its time. They all needed fresh water for drinking, as well as for public fountains, baths, and even imperial gardens. In peacetime, water ran freely through the complex infrastructure of the city. However, siege was a constant threat because Constantinople was both a citadel and a city. The genius of the cistern was its concealment. Invaders could poison external wells or cut off aqueducts, but they couldn't touch something they didn't know existed. Even while battle pounded the city's walls, the cistern, which was concealed beneath a plain edifice that was formerly a basilica, hence its name, served as a covert reservoir, serving the palace complex and neighboring neighborhoods. Its building was an engineering and human achievement. Under imperial commands, thousands of laborers, artisans, and slaves were employed. They recycled materials from all around the empire, but especially from Asia Minor temples. Because of this, some of the columns are plain, some are weirdly mismatched, and some are fluted ornately. In the service of empire, they were appropriated, transformed, and given new life. Even though it had a strictly utilitarian purpose, its design is unquestionably exquisite. In golden shafts, light filters down. The columns vanish into the dark, calm lake. Only the soft lapping of droplets falling from the ceiling breaks the silence. Today's visitors characterize it as ethereal, eerie, and graceful, like a cathedral designed for ghosts. The basilica cistern gradually disappeared from the public consciousness as empires came and went over the ages. It became one of the city's secret arteries, covered over, forgotten, and finally omitted from maps completely. Long after its creators had died, it continued to function and hold water. This subterranean sea is one of the few locations that best captures Constantinople's silent genius. Not all of it was architectural. In a world that was burning and collapsing, it was defiance built of stone and water saved. The basilica cistern was neglected for generations. It was merely buried rather than destroyed or wrecked. The city changed as the Ottoman Empire grew and the Byzantine Empire fell. Streets were moved, mansions were rebuilt, churches were converted to mosques, and names were altered. Beneath it all, however, the cistern stayed silent and dark, slowly gathering water. The cistern was already forgotten by the time the Ottomans took control of Constantinople in 1453. The Ottomans, who were also skilled architects, developed their own water management techniques. Because they viewed the older Byzantine cisterns as artifacts from a bygone era, they hardly ever used them. As a result, the basilica cistern was forgotten, not destroyed. However, it was unable to remain hidden indefinitely, as is sometimes the case with buried wonders. Tales started to spread. By lowering buckets into holes in their basements, residents of Istanbul's Sultanahmet neighborhood said they could draw up water and even catch fish. Others reported hearing voices and spooky echoes from below earth. Others claimed that despite the intense summer heat, their cellars remained abnormally chilly. Curiosity awoke. The cistern wasn't officially rediscovered until 1545, over a millennium after it was built. Working on topographical studies of the ancient city, a scholar by the name of Petrus Gillius examined and listened to local rumors. He went into a private house and went down into the dark by torchlight. And there it was, a huge, resonant room of stone and water, immaculately preserved beneath the surface of the earth. He depicted the room in wonder, with columns vanishing into the shadows, fish swimming through quiet water, and the occasional slight rippling sound coming from above. The cistern was reintroduced to the public through his writings, and its tale gradually reappeared. However, the cistern was mostly ignored even when it was found again. It wasn't lit, renovated, or accessible to the general public, but locals occasionally utilized it as a well or for fishing. It continued to be the realm of whispers and shadows for generations. The Basilica cistern didn't become a new Istanbul marvel until the 20th century with the advent of modern archaeology, tourism, and restoration. But during that protracted slumber, hidden beneath a thriving metropolis, it acquired a valuable quality, mystique. And because of such enigma, it evolved from a reservoir into a legend. Entering the Basilica cistern is like entering a lost universe where time is suspended in a mist and all sounds are muffled by stone. As soon as your foot touches the wooden path, 336 marble columns rise out of the shadowy water like a forest sculpted by forgotten hands. Like ancient titans upholding the earth, each one is almost 9 meters tall and supports the vaulted brick roof above. However, the cistern was not intended for these columns. They were repurposed, taken from forgotten ruins, palaces, and temples all around the empire. Because of the underground convergence of Roman, Greek, and even pagan craftsmanship, the cistern resembles a mosaic of cultures rather than colors. While some columns are basic and smooth, others have Corinthian capitals on top and are intricately fluted. Some are asymmetrical or chipped, indicating that they are used. Each one seems to carry a forgotten tale of its own, separated from its original form and reincarnated to contain water rather than gods. The brick-and-mortar ceiling is arranged in a network of quiet arches. The architecture is both amazing and practical. The air is chilly, humid, and thick with centuries, and the scale is almost supernatural. On the water's surface, light shimmers and reflects the arches and pillars in fascinating, shifting patterns. Water drips from the roof in a soft cadence that reverberates off the stone and murmurs into the cavern. Carp, offspring of those introduced long ago, glide languidly through black water beneath the sidewalks. The only living beings who have never left are them. Not in the religious sense, but more in the weight of time. There is a sense of reverence here. You are encircled by columns that were taken from temples, erected by slaves, abandoned by empires, and meticulously illuminated for contemporary viewing. People naturally become hushed in this place, as if the cistern itself deserves respect, rather than because it has to be. This is more than simply a ruin. It is a living reminder of Ottoman apathy, Byzantine practicality, Roman magnificence, and contemporary awe. Not only do the columns support the ceiling, but they also preserve history, stillness, and the gap between the past and present. All they ask of you is that you pay attention. Two of the Basilica cistern's most enigmatic and recognizable features are the Medusa heads, which are hidden away in the cistern's far northwest corner, past rows of shadowy columns and flickering reflections. 2 columns are based on these enormous stone carvings, whose provenance is unclear, whose function is up for debate, and their expressions are permanently set in stone. As if carelessly abandoned, the first Medusa head rests on its side, holding up a column. Even stranger is the second, with her face oddly composed and her serpentine hair drooping into the moisture. No inscription identifies their origin, and no plaque explains them. They just are. From where did they originate? The majority of academics think that they were taken from a late Roman temple that may have been devoted to the goddess Athena and utilized as practical building materials, another instance of Justinian's empire recycling its history. The selection of 2 identical legendary statues, both concealed in a shadowy area of the cistern, however, points to a possibility beyond simple recycling. In Greek mythology, Medusa was a gorgon, a snake-haired creature whose stare had the power to turn men to stone. Her picture was frequently carved into doors, shields, and floors as a symbol of protection to ward off evil. Is this the reason she was put here? Beneath the surface, a protective talisman protecting the city's vitality, or is it a more political issue? Some historians think that putting Medusa on her side or upside down was a symbolic act that rejected pagan authority in favor of Christian governance, as though to convey the idea that the ancient gods are now quiet and helpless. However, nothing is verified, and they are powerful because of that. It gives the impression that they are watching, not malicious, not irate, but present because of the dim illumination that falls on their faces, the sound of dripping water all around them, and the way they sleep under centuries of weight. In an otherwise organized space, they are the inexplicable echo. You come for the columns and stay for the silence, but what stays with you long after you've left are the silent, odd, and submerged Medusa heads. The Basilica Cistern is more than just a stunning piece of architecture. It is a slowed-down sensory experience. When you enter, the contemporary world becomes hazy. The dull, amber brightness becomes used to your eyes. The echo of a single droplet dropping from the arched ceiling reaches your ears. Then all of a sudden you're not in Istanbul anymore. Time, sound, and light all drift differently in this place. Here, sound acts strangely. Footsteps do not reverberate normally. They bounce lightly against damp stone and ripple. Hushed conversations are instinctive rather than a result of manners. Centuries' weight weighs heavily. As though they also value the stillness, even the fish appear to swim peacefully. The light comes next. During the day, a few natural shafts shine down from above, like searchlights from another universe, piercing the darkness with their faint sunbeams. The columns' rough textures and mismatched forms are highlighted by the striking shadows generated by contemporary lighting at night or in the deeper nooks. With each change of viewpoint, something new is revealed. The shine of moisture on a stone face, a different column base, or a varied ceiling height. Now, only a few feet deep, the black, motionless water turns into a mirror. By reflecting the columns above, it doubles the room's height and transforms the cistern into an illusionary hall. Sometimes it's difficult to distinguish between the stone and its reflection. Sometimes a droplet falls or a fish gently ripples over the surface, giving the impression that the cistern is breathing, ancient, serene, and slow. Artists and musicians have been drawn to perform here in the modern era. It has unparalleled acoustics. A lone cello's drone and a voice's steady chant take on an unearthly quality. The cistern does more than merely echo. It retains sound for a long time after it is created, just like water does. However, the room feels alive, not haunted but conscious, even in the absence of music. Each arch seems to be a doorway. Each column serves as a sentinel. Each sound is a whisper from a different time. The Basilica Cistern is more than simply a site, it's an experience, a location where silence turns into a sort of music and shadow turns into a story, a sacred stop beneath the bustle of a city. The Basilica Cistern was a useful area created for survival that was lost for centuries before being found. However, it has evolved into something very distinct in the contemporary era, representing Istanbul's multifaceted identity as a fusion of East and West, water and stone, empire and myth. As interest in conserving Istanbul's historic treasures increased in the 1980s, restoration work got underway. The cistern had been subjected to abuse, floods, and neglect. It had even occasionally been used as a place for illegal fishing or dumping. However, conservation crews put in wooden walkways, subdued lighting, strengthened deteriorating columns, and drained the water. It was formally reopened to the public in 1987. As the tourists started to arrive, they poured in. One of Istanbul's most visited landmarks is what was formerly unseen beneath the city's surface. Photographers sought its shadows, authors found metaphors in its calm, directors, of course, or something else entirely, and travel publications delighted at it, atmosphere. The Basilica cistern quickly gained popularity as a backdrop for movies, adding its eerie atmosphere to everything from blockbusters to documentaries. The most well-known instance of it was when 007 ascended a small boat between the columns beneath Istanbul in the 1963 James Bond movie From Russia with Love. The historic reservoir was used as a setting for contemporary tension in the 2016 film Inferno, which was based on Dan Brown's thriller. The cistern, however, is more than just a movie set. It is a reflection of Istanbul, a city that is always being constructed on top of its history. History underfoot, palaces next to skyscrapers, churches beneath mosques. The cistern serves as a reminder that even beneath the surface of our daily existence, the ruins of ancient civilizations are still there, patiently waiting. Part of its potency comes from its transition from utility to icon. Emperors can no longer use it, yet residents, tourists, and artists still find value in it. Without using words or a ceremony, it establishes a link between the past and present. The world now whispers the name of a location that was originally built in seclusion. It's more than just a cistern now, it is a gateway to memory, mystery, and the hidden core of a city that defies forgetting. It's easy to forget how brittle the Basilica cistern originally was and how near to loss it was when you go inside it today. The building lacks a grand entryway and a tall facade. It was never supposed to sparkle, it was supposed to vanish. Nevertheless, it has withstood neglect, invasions, earthquakes, and the relentless passage of time. However, survival is not a coincidence. A succession of silent protectors, not emperors or generals, but engineers, academics, and inquisitive locals, were responsible for the cistern's preservation. Residents used wells and cellars to access it, and it was unofficially maintained during the Ottoman era. They appreciated what it provided: cold, pure water, and maybe a feeling of mystery beneath their houses, even though they might not have fully understood its scope. The cistern was first thoroughly documented in the 19th and 20th centuries by academics such as Petrus Gilius and later Turkish archaeologists. They charted its columns, located the source of its marble, and started posing the queries that transformed it from a secret area into a topic of interest. Their silent commitment served as the foundation for recovery. Today it is protected by the caretakers, guides, and preservationists who keep it intact, regulate humidity, manage algae, and make sure guests are secure when walking on hanging pathways. The columns need to be watched, the still water needs to be controlled, and even the light needs to be carefully regulated. If it's too much, the atmosphere is destroyed. If there is too little, the past will return to the shadows. It is also protected by storytellers who convey its past and give meaning to the stillness. The cistern is kept by every guide, documentary, and silent tourist who stays a little longer in front of the Medusa heads. The inhabitants, Istanbulites, who grew up hearing stories about fish in basement wells and dark stone rooms beneath the city, should also not be overlooked. They view the cistern as more than just a tourist attraction. To them, it is a neighbor and a hidden legend. The Basilica cistern has survived because generations have refused to let it be forgotten, not because it required attention, even if the emperors above have collapsed, and the palaces they served are now museums. Not every guardian is armed with a sword. Some people bring notes, torches, or just plain decency. More than just water and stone, the Basilica cistern is a silent reminder of the past. It is unaffected by the clamour of taxis, the ringing of tram bells, or the call to prayer above, even though it is located beneath the bustle of contemporary Istanbul. Everything slows down here. Instead of going to the cistern, you go down into it, as though you were walking into a dream that the earth itself was whispering. Its calm is its real force. Nothing cries out or is noisy here. The arches don't brag, the Medusa heads don't shout, and the columns don't shout. Nevertheless, everything speaks, slowly and quietly, if you can listen. The ceiling reflects time, and the water reflects the ceiling. You start to question whether the location is indeed underground or merely beyond the bounds of reality. This monument just remains. It doesn't contain mosaic saints or gilded domes, nor does it honor conquest or faith. Its ability to transform the pragmatic into the lyrical and its refusal to fade are what make it so beautiful. It was constructed to keep water, but today it holds amazement. Every guest takes something new with them. Some people are amazed that a building so old could still be in such good condition. Others see it as peace and a respite from the commotion above. And it's a mystery to many. What caused the Medusa heads to be positioned that way? These columns were formed by whom? How many forgotten hands toiled silently to create this living, breathing place? The enchantment remains intact as the trip comes to a conclusion and you ascend the stairs back into daylight. Part of you remains even when you emerge into the sunshine, the fragrance of roasted chestnuts and the sound of automobiles and footsteps. A part of you can still see the flare of gold light on old stone and hear the sound of water dripping. The basilica cistern is more than simply a relic. It serves as a reminder that something older, deeper, and lurking in the shadows lies beneath every city, empire, and story. The saying, "Still waters run deep," reverberates endlessly in the center of Istanbul,